My name is Joaquin Morales. I'm a tattoo artist from East LA, and I survived the first 90 days when the world froze over. When Yellowstone erupted, we thought the ash and snow were temporary. We were wrong. The Ice Age apocalypse killed billions, but I kept my neighbors alive with steady hands and street smarts. I watched friends freeze, made impossible choices, and lost the woman who became my grandmother. Now I'm heading south to find my sister, carrying 90 days of death and survival in my sketchbook. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I was inking a Virgin Mary portrait on Roberto's shoulder when every phone in East LA started screaming at once. It was Tuesday, October 15th, 2024, around 2:30 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because Mrs. Gutierrez from the panaderia next door had just brought me fresh concas for lunch, still warm from her ovens. The autumn heat was brutal that day, pushing 95 degrees, and my shop's ancient air conditioner was rattling like it was about to give up completely. Roberto was my 2 o'clock appointment, a construction worker who'd been coming to me for 3 years. We were halfway through the Virgin's face when the emergency alerts started going off. Not just his phone, but every single device in the neighborhood. The sound was deafening. Phones, tablets, radios, televisions, all screaming that same bone-chilling alert tone you hear in your nightmares. Roberto sat up so fast he nearly knocked over my ink caps. His shirt was still off, the half-finished tattoo bleeding slightly where the needle had been working. "Essay, what the hell is happening?" he asked, grabbing his phone with hands that were suddenly shaking. I set down my tattoo machine and reached for my own device, my hands steady as always. Even in moments of chaos, my hands never shake. It's something I've always prided myself on. Steady hands make for clean lines, whether you're tattooing or trying to stay alive. The screen was filled with breaking news alerts. Yellowstone, supervolcano, catastrophic eruption. The words didn't make sense at first. Roberto was scrolling through his social media, showing me video after video of this massive mushroom cloud rising from Wyoming. It looked like something out of a disaster movie, the kind of thing you watch on a Saturday night with popcorn, not something that actually happens in real life. "Joaquin, what does this mean for us?" Roberto asked, and I could hear the fear creeping into his voice. He was looking at me like I had answers, like somehow being a tattoo artist had prepared me for understanding volcanic eruptions. I didn't know then that within 3 months, my steady hands would be the difference between life and death for the people I cared about. I didn't know that the art supplies I hoarded in my back room would become more valuable than gold. I didn't know that this moment, this exact Tuesday afternoon, was the last time any of us would feel truly safe. "I don't know, brother," I told him honestly, "but let me finish this Virgin Mary. She's going to watch over you no matter what happens." It seemed important somehow, completing that tattoo. Like if I could just finish the Holy Mother's face, maybe she'd protect us from whatever was coming. The news kept getting worse. They were calling it the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. Ash clouds 30 miles high, pyroclastic flows, terms I'd never heard before, but that sounded terrifying. The reporters kept using words like unprecedented and catastrophic and global impact. But they also kept saying things like temporary disruption and recovery efforts and return to normal. Looking back, I think they were trying to keep people from panicking. It didn't work. Mrs. Gutierrez appeared in my doorway around 4 o'clock, her face pale with worry. She'd been running her panaderia for 40 years, ever since she and her husband moved to the neighborhood from Guadalajara. She was the kind of woman who knew everyone's business and somehow always had fresh bread when you needed it most. "Me," she said to me, "the news is saying we might get some ash here. Should I close the bakery?" I looked at Roberto, who was now fully dressed and studying his fresh bandage in my mirror. The Virgin Mary's face was complete, her eyes serene and protective. "What do you think?" I asked him. Roberto worked construction. He understood weather and its effects on daily life better than most people. Ash is just dust, right? He said, but he didn't sound convinced. How bad could it be? Mrs. Gutierrez shook her head. My sister lives near Mount St. Helens. She told me stories about when that one erupted back in '80. Said the ash got into everything. Made it hard to breathe, hard to drive, hard to do anything. But this one is supposed to be much bigger. That was the first time I heard anyone suggest this might be different. Bigger. Mrs. Gutierrez had lived through enough to recognize when something wasn't normal. She'd survived the LA riots, the Northridge earthquake, floods and fires, and every disaster Southern California could throw at people. If she was worried, maybe we should be too. Roberto paid for his tattoo and left, promising to come back in 2 weeks to start the background work. I watched him walk down the street, noting how he kept looking up at the sky like he expected to see something falling. The sun was still shining. The temperature was still close to 100 degrees. Everything looked normal, but there was this feeling in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm when all the birds go quiet. That evening, I called my sister Maria. She was studying nursing at UC San Diego in her 3rd year of the program. She'd always been the smart one in our family, the one who was going to make something of herself. While I was dropping out of college to chase my dream of becoming a tattoo artist, she was studying anatomy and pharmacology, and all the things that would let her save lives. "Joaquin, I've been trying to call you," she said as soon as she picked up. "Are you seeing the news? They're saying the ash cloud is going to spread across the whole country." "You think it's that bad?" I asked. Maria had always been level-headed, not prone to panic. If she was worried, I needed to take this seriously. "I don't know," she admitted. "But my professors are talking about it. They're saying this could affect weather patterns globally, maybe for years." One of them compared it to the year without a summer back in 1816, when another volcano caused crop failures all over the world. Years. The word hit me harder than I expected. I was looking around my shop, at all the artwork on the walls, the flash sheets I'd drawn, the photographs of tattoos I'd completed. Everything seemed so permanent, but suddenly I was wondering if any of it would matter if the world was about to change that dramatically. "Should you come home?" I asked her. "I mean just until things settle down." "I don't know," she said again. "Maybe. Let me see what happens in the next few days, but Joaquin, promise me something. If things get bad, if the power goes out or food gets scarce, don't try to be a hero. Take care of yourself first." It was funny advice coming from someone studying to be a nurse, someone whose whole career would be about putting other people first. But Maria knew me better than anyone. She knew I had a tendency to take responsibility for everyone around me, to try to fix problems that weren't mine to fix. She knew that my community organizing skills, honed through years of putting together art shows and neighborhood events, would kick in if people needed help. She was warning me about something I hadn't even recognized in myself yet. After we hung up, I spent the evening sketching. It's what I always did when I was anxious or needed to think. I drew Mrs. Gutierrez kneading dough, her hands strong and sure despite her age. I drew Roberto's face when he first saw the news alerts, the way fear and confusion mixed in his expression. I drew my own hands holding the tattoo machine, steady and precise, even when everything else felt uncertain. I didn't know then that these sketches would become the beginning of something bigger, a record of what was about to happen, a way to preserve the memory of the world before it changed forever. All I knew was that drawing helped me process what I was feeling, and what I was feeling was the first real fear I'd experienced since I was a kid. Wednesday morning brought the first sign that this wasn't going to be just another news story. I opened my shop at 9 o'clock like always, but instead of my usual stream of walk-in customers, the street was quieter than I'd ever seen it. The few people who were out were walking quickly, their heads down, phones pressed to their ears. Mrs. Gutierrez's bakery was closed. A handwritten sign in the window said, "Gone to buy supplies, back soon." My first appointment was canceled, then my second. By noon, I'd had 4 cancellations and only one walk-in, a teenager who wanted a small heart on her wrist. "Something to remember today by," she said, though she couldn't explain what made today worth remembering. I gave her the tattoo for half price because something about her urgency felt important. Around 2 o'clock, Mrs. Gutierrez returned with her car packed so full of groceries that she could barely close the trunk. She was loading bag after bag into her store, moving with a purpose I'd never seen from her before. When I went over to help, I could see what she'd bought. Flour, lots of it, enough to last months, canned goods, rice, dried beans, water bottles. "Planning to feed the whole neighborhood," I joked, but she didn't laugh. "Maybe," she said seriously. "Me, Joe, I lived through the earthquake. I know what happens when the trucks stop coming. Better to have too much than too little." The trucks stopped coming. That phrase stuck with me for the rest of the day. I'd never thought about how much our neighborhood depended on delivery trucks. Food, supplies, even the inks and equipment for my tattoo shop, everything came from somewhere else. If those trucks stopped, what would happen to us? That evening, I went through my shop's inventory more carefully than I ever had before. I had plenty of tattoo supplies, probably enough to last 6 months if business stayed normal. But business wasn't staying normal. In the back storage room, I found boxes of art supplies I'd been hoarding for years. Pencils, charcoal, paints, brushes, sketchbooks. Stuff I'd bought on sale or inherited from other artists who'd moved away or given up. I'd always told myself I'd use it someday for personal projects, but mostly it just sat there collecting dust. Looking at those boxes, I had the strangest feeling that they might become important. Not for art, necessarily, but for something. I couldn't shake the thought that in whatever was coming, having extra supplies of any kind might matter. My perfectionist nature kicked in, and I started making lists of everything I had, organizing it by type and quantity. It seemed like the responsible thing to do. Thursday brought the first ash. Not much, just a light dusting that looked like someone had scattered cigarette ash over the whole city. Most people were treating it like a novelty, taking pictures for social media, making jokes about free exfoliation. But when I swept the ash off my shop's front steps, it felt gritty between my fingers and left a metallic taste in my mouth that water couldn't wash away. Roberto came by around lunchtime, not for tattoo work but just to talk. He'd been laid off from his construction job. "Boss says it's temporary," he explained, "but the ash is getting into all the equipment. Makes it hard to work outside." He looked different than he had 2 days earlier. Tired, worried. The Virgin Mary tattoo on his shoulder was healing well, but the rest of him seemed to be falling apart. "How long you think this lasts?" he asked me. I didn't have an answer. The news was still calling it temporary, but temporary could mean weeks or months. I was starting to understand that nobody really knew what was happening. This was bigger than anything in living memory, and all the experts were making educated guesses at best. "Want some coffee?" I offered. Roberto nodded, and I brewed a pot on the small machine I kept in the back of the shop. We sat there drinking coffee and watching the ash collect on my front window, not talking much but somehow comforted by each other's presence. I didn't know then that these quiet moments with friends would become some of my most precious memories. When the world falls apart, you learn to value the simple act of sharing coffee with someone who understands what you're going through. Friday was when I first understood we were in real trouble. The ash was heavier now and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees overnight. In October, in Los Angeles. I'd lived in this city my whole life, and I'd never experienced anything like it. The sun looked different too, dimmer, filtered through layers of volcanic ash that turned everything orange and hazy. Mrs. Gutierrez knocked on my door around 9 in the morning. "Me, come help me move some things," she said. When I got to her store, I saw what she meant. She was moving all her most valuable inventory to the back room, away from the windows. "People are starting to panic," she explained. "I saw someone try to break into the pharmacy last night. Thank God old Mr. Kim has those metal shutters." Panic. It was the first time anyone had used that word out loud, but I could feel it building in the neighborhood. The ash was getting worse, the temperature was dropping, and the news reports were becoming more alarming even as they tried to maintain calm. Scientists were talking about global cooling, agricultural disruption, supply chain interruptions, all very clinical terms for what was starting to feel like the end of the world. That afternoon, I had my first customer in 3 days. A woman I'd never seen before, probably in her 50s, who wanted a portrait of her daughter tattooed on her forearm. She showed me a photo of a young woman in a graduation cap and gown, smiling broadly at the camera. "She's in college back east," the woman explained. "I can't get through to her. The phones are all messed up." Her hands were shaking as she handed me the photo. "I just want to have her with me, in case." In case. We all knew what she meant, even if nobody wanted to say it out loud. In case the communication stayed down. In case travel became impossible. In case we never saw our loved ones again. I took extra care with that tattoo, making sure every detail of the young woman's face was perfect. It took 4 hours, longer than it should have, but the mother sat perfectly still the entire time. When I finished, she looked at her arm and started crying. "She's beautiful," I told her, and I meant it. The tattoo had captured something essential about the girl in the photo, some quality of hope and youth that felt especially precious in that moment. "Thank you," the woman said, paying me double what I'd asked for. As she was leaving, she turned back. "You should call your family," she said quietly, "while you still can." That evening, I tried calling Maria again but couldn't get through. The phone lines were overwhelmed, and when I did connect, the call kept dropping. I managed to get through to my parents in Phoenix long enough to confirm they were okay, but even that conversation was fragmented and full of static. They were experiencing ash fall too, though not as heavy as what we were getting in LA. My father, ever practical, told me to stock up on food and water. "Just in case this lasts longer than they're saying," he added. "Just in case." Those 3 words were becoming the theme of everyone's conversations. Just in case the stores close. Just in case the power goes out. Just in case this isn't temporary after all. I spent that evening taking inventory of my personal supplies. I had enough food for maybe a week, less if I was feeding other people. My apartment above the shop was comfortable but not designed for extended isolation. I started making mental notes of what I'd need if things got worse. Saturday brought the first real snow. Not the pretty, fluffy kind you see in Christmas movies, but gray slush mixed with ash that hurt to breathe and stung your eyes. The temperature had dropped another 15 degrees overnight. In Los Angeles in October, it was snowing. I stood outside my shop at 7 in the morning, watching my breath fog in the air, and finally accepted that whatever was happening was beyond anything anyone had prepared for. The neighborhood was transforming. Most of the businesses on my block were closed, their owners either gone or hunkered down somewhere safer. The few people who were still around moved quickly from building to building, heads covered, faces masked against the ash. Mrs. Gutierrez's store had become an unofficial community center, with people stopping by to share information and check on each other. She'd started giving away some of her excess inventory to families with children, claiming she had more than she needed. "Money won't matter if we can't buy anything with it," she told me when I offered to pay for the groceries she'd given me. It was a disturbing thought, but looking around at our ash-covered, snow-dusted neighborhood, it was hard to argue with her logic. The normal economy was breaking down, and something else was taking its place. An economy based on survival, on mutual aid, on the recognition that we were all in this together. Roberto showed up that afternoon with 3 other guys from his construction crew. They'd been laid off indefinitely, and they were worried about their families. "You got space for us to stay warm?" one of them asked. "Our apartments don't have heat and it's getting cold." I looked at my small shop, at the artwork on the walls and the equipment I'd spent years collecting, and made a decision that surprised me. "Yeah," I said, "we'll figure it out." My community organizing skills were kicking in without me even realizing it. I started thinking about how to arrange the space, how to share resources, how to keep everyone safe and fed. It felt natural, like something I'd been preparing for my whole life without knowing it. As Sunday arrived, the news reports were becoming increasingly desperate. The anchors were still trying to maintain professionalism, but you could hear the fear in their voices. They talked about global temperature drops, crop failures, supply chain disruptions. But they also kept insisting that help was coming, that the government had plans, that this was manageable. Watching them, I got the feeling they were trying to convince themselves as much as us. The ash was now several inches deep on the ground, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. The sun, when you could see it at all, was just a dim orange circle in the gray sky. Mrs. Gutierrez had started cooking communal meals in her store, using up the perishables before they spoiled. The electricity was still working, but there were rolling blackouts, and everyone understood it was only a matter of time before the power grid failed completely. That evening, as I sat in my shop surrounded by Roberto and his friends, all of us huddled around a small space heater, I started sketching again. But this time, I wasn't drawing from memory or imagination. I was documenting what I was seeing. The way the ash collected in the corners of windows, the expression on Mrs. Gutierrez's face as she handed out free food, the way people moved differently now, with purpose and urgency, like they were conserving energy for something bigger. I didn't know then that these sketches would become the foundation of a much larger project, a visual record of how the world ended and how we tried to survive it. All I knew was that someone needed to remember what this looked like, what it felt like to watch everything familiar disappear under gray ash and dirty snow. My perfectionist nature was demanding that I get every detail right, every shadow and texture and expression. If this was the end of the world, I was going to document it properly. As I drew, Roberto watched over my shoulder. "That's good, man," he said quietly. "Really good. You're capturing something important." He paused, then added, "Maybe someday people will want to know what this was like, what we went through. Someday." It seemed impossible to imagine a someday beyond this gray, cold present. But the idea that my art might serve a purpose beyond personal expression was comforting. Maybe my steady hands and eye for detail would matter for more than just tattoos. Maybe the skills I developed over years of careful, precise work would help preserve something valuable for whatever came next. The temperature that night dropped below freezing for the first time in Lowe's Angel's history. We could hear it in the way the ash and snow crunched under people's feet, in the way the metal shutters on nearby stores contracted and popped. Inside my shop, 6 of us shared blankets and body heat, trying to stay warm enough to sleep. Mrs. Gutierrez had given us extra food, and we'd pooled our resources to buy batteries and flashlights and other emergency supplies. But even with all our preparation, I could feel how precarious our situation was becoming. The trucks had stopped coming, just like Mrs. Gutierrez had predicted. The stores were running out of supplies. The power was failing more frequently. And winter, whatever this gray, ash-filled winter was going to be, had only just begun. I lay awake that night listening to the wind howl outside, carrying more ash and snow, and wondered if my sister Maria was safe in San Diego. I wondered if the phones would work tomorrow, if I'd be able to reach her again before it was too late. I had no way of knowing that 18 days had passed since the eruption, or that we were about to enter a phase where the real challenges would begin. The denial was over. The normal world was gone. What came next would test everything I thought I knew about survival, about community, about what it means to be human when all the comfortable illusions fall away. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the gentle snoring of my neighbors who had become my family, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Despite everything that was happening, despite the fear and uncertainty and loss, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I had a purpose. My steady hands, my hoarded art supplies, my instinct to bring people together, All of it was about to become essential in ways I couldn't have imagined just 3 weeks earlier. The morning of day 19 was when I understood we weren't going back to normal. I woke up in my shop to find Roberto shaking with fever, his forehead burning hot despite the freezing air around us. The Virgin Mary tattoo on his shoulder looked angry and inflamed, probably infected from the ash that had gotten everywhere. We didn't have antibiotics. We didn't have proper medical supplies. All I had were my steady hands and a growing realization that those hands might need to do more than just create art. Mrs. Gutierrez appeared at my door before 8 that morning, carrying a steaming pot of something that smelled like heaven. "Soup," she announced, ladling it into whatever containers we could find. "My grandmother's recipe. It'll help with the fever." She looked at Roberto with the kind of knowing expression that comes from raising 6 children through various illnesses. "The ash is making everyone sick. We need to start boiling all our water and covering our faces when we go outside." It was November 8th, exactly 3 weeks since Yellowstone erupted, and Mrs. Gutierrez's panaderia had been dark for 2 days. The ovens were cold, the display cases empty. She'd run out of flour and couldn't get more because the delivery trucks had stopped coming entirely. Looking at her empty bakery through the ash-covered windows, I realized that our neighborhood's heart had stopped beating. Without the warm smell of fresh bread, without the constant stream of customers, the whole block felt lifeless. That afternoon, I tried calling Maria again using the landline in Mrs. Gutierrez's store. The phone lines were working sporadically, and after 20 minutes of busy signals, I finally got through. Her voice sounded thin and distant, like she was calling from another planet. "Joaquin, thank God," she said. "I've been so worried." "How bad is it there?" "Bad," I told her honestly. "The ash is everywhere. It's been snowing for days and most of the businesses are closed. Roberto's sick and I don't know how to help him." There was a long pause. When Maria spoke again, her voice had shifted into what I called her nursing student mode, clinical and focused. "What are his symptoms?" "Fever, chills, respiratory issues." I described Roberto's condition as best I could. Maria listened carefully, then started giving me instructions. How to check for pneumonia. How to make a makeshift humidifier to help him breathe. How to monitor his temperature and what signs to watch for that would mean he was getting worse. As she talked, I realized that my sister had knowledge that could save lives, and she was hundreds of miles away when we needed her most. "I wish I was there," she said quietly. "I wish I could help." "Maybe you should stay in San Diego," I told her. "It might be safer there, warmer, better medical facilities." "Maybe," she agreed, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. "Joaquin, I need to tell you something. The professors here are talking about this lasting a long time. Years, not months. They're comparing it to volcanic winters from history, events that changed entire civilizations. Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't try to save everyone." Years. The word hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking in terms of weeks, maybe months. The idea that this gray, cold world might be permanent was almost impossible to process. But as I looked around Mrs. Gutierrez's empty store, at the ash-covered windows and the empty shelves, I started to understand what Maria was trying to tell me. This wasn't a temporary disaster we could wait out. This was a new reality we had to learn to live in. After I hung up with Maria, Mrs. Gutierrez and I sat in her store drinking the last of her coffee. The silence between us was comfortable but heavy with unspoken understanding. We both knew the old world was gone, but neither of us wanted to be the first to say it out loud. "My husband would have known what to do," she said finally. "He was good with his hands, good at fixing things. Made our car run for 20 years after it should have died." She gestured toward a box of tools in the corner, stuff I'd never noticed before. "I keep meaning to get rid of those, but now I'm thinking maybe they'll be useful." I looked at the tools, thinking about Roberto's fever and our growing list of problems that couldn't be solved with art or good intentions. "Would you teach me," I asked, "how to use them?" Mrs. Gutierrez smiled for the first time in days. "She, Mijo, we teach each other what we know. That's how we survive this. Over the next few days, our small group developed routines that felt almost normal. Mrs. Gutierrez would wake up first and start cooking whatever food we had. Roberto, despite his fever, would help organize supplies and keep watch. The other construction workers would venture out to scavenge for materials we needed. And I would document everything, sketching our daily life and trying to capture the strange beauty that existed even in this gray, ash-covered world. My art supplies were becoming more valuable than I'd ever imagined. Not just for creating pictures, but for practical purposes. Charcoal could be used for water filtration. Canvas could be cut up for face masks. Pencils could mark important supplies or leave messages for other survivors. Every item in my hoarded collection had potential uses I'd never considered. My perfectionist nature kicked in as I started cataloging everything by potential function, not just artistic purpose. The first death happened on day 25. Mrs. Chen from the laundromat, an elderly woman who lived alone above her business. We'd been checking on her daily, bringing her food and medicine when we could find it, but the cold and ash had been too much for her lungs. Roberto found her when he went to deliver soup, still in her bed, looking peaceful but terribly small. I'd never drawn a dead person before, but something compelled me to sketch Mrs. Chen's face. Not out of morbid fascination, but because I realized that in this new world, someone needed to remember the people we lost. Someone needed to create a record of who they were, what they looked like, how they mattered. My hands were steady as I worked, capturing the lines around her eyes that spoke of decades of laughter, the careful way she'd arranged her gray hair even in her final days. "That's beautiful," Mrs. Gutierrez said when she saw the portrait. She would have liked that. She was always vain about her appearance. She paused, studying my work. "You have a gift, Mijo, for seeing people as they really are." The memorial drawing became the first in what would become a much larger project. I started thinking about how to preserve the memory of our community, of the people who'd lived and worked and loved in this neighborhood before the ash started falling. My documentation wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about bearing witness to what we'd lost and who we'd been. Thanksgiving came and went without much acknowledgement. The calendar said it was the fourth Thursday in November, but time felt different now. Days blended together in a gray haze of survival tasks and shared meals and gradual adaptation to our new reality. We marked the holiday by burning my wooden art easels for warmth and sharing the last can of cranberry sauce Mrs. Gutierrez had saved from her store. "What are you thankful for?" she asked as we sat around the small fire, our faces lit by flames that consumed my artistic tools. It should have been a difficult question. We'd lost so much, suffered so much, watched our world disappear under ash and snow, but the answer came easily. "This," I said, gesturing at our small circle. "Having people to go through this with. Not being alone." Roberto nodded, his fever finally broken after a week of careful nursing. "Family," he agreed, "even if it's not the family we were born with." Mrs. Gutierrez smiled, but I could see sadness in her eyes. She'd had children once, grandchildren, but they'd moved away years ago and we hadn't been able to contact them since the phones became unreliable. "Sometimes family is who you choose," she said quietly, "who you decide to take care of when everything falls apart." December brought the real cold. Not just chilly mornings and cool evenings, but bone-deep, killing cold that made every breath visible and turned water to ice within minutes of being exposed to air. The sun, when we could see it through the ash clouds, was a dim orange disk that provided no warmth. The temperature hadn't been above freezing in 2 weeks, and the snow was accumulating faster than we could clear it away. Our small group had grown to 8 people. Besides Roberto, Mrs. Gutierrez, and myself, we'd taken in Alina, an elderly woman who ran the corner store, and 4 other neighbors whose apartments had become too cold to inhabit. Alina had surprised everyone by revealing a tough, practical streak that contradicted her frail appearance. She'd lived through the Depression as a child and had survival skills none of the rest of us possessed. "You young people don't know how to make do," she told us with affection rather than criticism. "You think everything has to be perfect, everything has to be new. But look." She showed us how to mend clothes with scraps, how to make soap from ash and animal fat, how to preserve food without refrigeration. My mother taught me these things during the hard times. Never thought I'd need them again. Alina's knowledge was invaluable, but I could see that the physical demands of our situation were wearing on her. She moved more slowly each day, needed more help with tasks that had been easy for her just weeks earlier. I started paying closer attention to her health, using the observational skills I'd developed as an artist to notice small changes in her color, her breathing, her energy levels. Something told me I'd need to be ready to help her in ways that went beyond just sharing food and warmth. The power grid finally failed completely on December 15th. We'd been dealing with rolling blackouts for weeks, but that morning the electricity went out and never came back on. No heat, no lights, no way to charge phones or get news from the outside world. The silence was profound and terrifying. For the first time since the eruption, we were completely cut off from the rest of the world, but we'd been preparing for this moment without realizing it. Mrs. Gutierrez had candles and matches. Alina knew how to cook over an open fire. Roberto and his construction friends knew how to jerry-rig heating systems, using whatever materials we could scavenge. And I had my art supplies, which were proving useful in unexpected ways. My sketchbooks became notebooks for planning and record keeping. My pencils were perfect for marking supplies and leaving messages. My steady hands were essential for delicate tasks like mending equipment or tending to minor injuries. That first night without power, we all slept in my shop, huddled together for warmth under every blanket and piece of clothing we could find. The temperature inside dropped to just above freezing, and we took turns staying awake to feed our makeshift fire. I spent my watch time sketching the faces of my sleeping companions, trying to capture something about their trust and vulnerability that felt sacred. "Can't sleep either," Alina whispered during her watch, settling down beside me with surprising quiet for someone her age. "Too much to think about," I admitted, wondering what comes next, whether we're doing the right things. Alina studied my sketches for a moment. "You're an artist," she said. It wasn't a question. "Tattoo artist mostly, but I draw other things too." "Good," she said firmly. "Someone needs to remember this. What it was like, what we did, who we were. People will want to know someday when this is over." When this is over. Alina said it with such certainty that I almost believed her. Almost let myself imagine a future where the sun shone warm again, where the ash settled and plants grew and life returned to something resembling normal. But looking around at our makeshift camp, at the faces of people who'd become my family through shared hardship, I realized that even if the world healed, we would never be the same people we'd been before the sky went dark. Christmas Eve brought our first good news in weeks. Roberto had found a working radio in an abandoned electronics store, and after hours of trying different frequencies, we'd picked up a broadcast from somewhere south of us. The voice was scratchy and distant, but it was human contact with the outside world. "This is Emergency Broadcast Station KPCC, transmitting from an undisclosed location in Orange County," the voice said. "Today is December 24th, 2024. For anyone still listening, we want you to know you're not alone. There are survivors throughout Southern California, and we're organizing mutual aid networks and evacuation routes for those who want to head south toward warmer climates." South. Toward San Diego, where Maria was studying nursing. Toward the Mexican border, where temperatures might be more survivable. The broadcast mentioned convoy departure points and supply stations, safe routes and dangerous areas to avoid. For the first time in weeks, I felt something that might have been hope. But Alina was getting sicker. The cold and poor nutrition were taking their toll, and no amount of careful nursing seemed to help. She developed a cough that racked her small frame and left her exhausted. She was eating less, claiming she wasn't hungry, but I could see she was trying to conserve food for the rest of us. Her selflessness was going to kill her if we couldn't find better shelter and medical care. "We should think about leaving," I said during one of our evening planning sessions. "The radio said there are warmer places south of here, better resources." "What about Alina?" Mrs. Gutierrez asked quietly. "She's not strong enough for a long journey." It was the question none of us wanted to ask directly. Do we stay and risk everyone dying slowly? Or do we leave and risk Alina dying quickly? Do we make the hard choice that prioritizes the survival of the group over the needs of our most vulnerable member? "We don't leave anyone behind," I said firmly, surprising myself with the strength of my conviction. "We figure out how to take her with us, or we all stay together." Roberto nodded agreement. "That's right, we're family now. Family doesn't get left behind." Alina, who'd been quiet through this discussion, looked up from the blanket where she'd been resting. "You foolish children," she said with affection. "I'm an old woman who's lived her life. Don't sacrifice yourselves for someone who's going to die anyway." "No," I said, more firmly than I'd ever spoken to her before. "We're not having that conversation. We figure out how to all survive together, or we don't survive at all." That night, I sat up late working on detailed sketches of possible travel routes, using my artistic training to visualize problems and solutions. How to build a sled or stretcher for Alina. How to carry enough supplies for 8 people. How to stay warm during travel through the ash-covered wasteland that Southern California had become. My perfectionist nature was demanding that I plan for every contingency, every possible disaster that could befall us on the road. But as I drew, I kept thinking about Alina's words, about sacrifice and survival, and what we owed to each other in a world where resources were scarce, and every choice carried life or death consequences. I thought about Maria's warning about not trying to save everyone, about the practical reality that sometimes good people die despite your best efforts. New Year's Eve passed without celebration. We marked the transition to 2025 by sharing a bottle of wine Mrs. Gutierrez had been saving for a special occasion, each person taking a small sip and making a private wish for the year ahead. The wine was warm and sweet and reminded me of better times, of celebrations with music and laughter, and the assumption that there would always be more celebrations to come. "What's your wish?" Alina asked me as I passed the bottle to her with careful hands. I thought about lying, about giving her some hopeful platitude about the future. But Alina deserved honesty. "That we find Maria safe in San Diego," I said. "That we make it through this winter. That someday people will see these drawings and understand what we went through." Alina took her small sip of wine and smiled. "Good wishes," she said. "Practical and heartfelt. That's how you survive when the world ends. You hold onto what matters and let go of what doesn't." The radio broadcasts were becoming more frequent and more organized. We learned that there were survivor communities throughout the region, some thriving and some barely hanging on. There were stories of amazing cooperation and devastating betrayal, of heroes and villains emerging from ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances. Most importantly, there were confirmed reports of warmer weather and better growing conditions south of Los Angeles, particularly near the Mexican border. Alina's condition continued to deteriorate, but she refused to discuss the possibility of staying behind. "If you're all going south, then I'm going south too," she said stubbornly. "I didn't survive the depression and 2 heart attacks just to give up now." Her determination was inspiring, but I could see the toll that simple conversations were taking on her energy. During the first week of January, I started making serious preparations for travel. My steady hands proved essential for detailed planning and equipment preparation. I drew maps based on the radio broadcasts, marking safe routes and resource locations. I organized our supplies by weight and necessity, figuring out how to carry everything we'd need for a journey that could take weeks. I even started sketching possible modifications to shopping carts and wheelbarrows that could serve as transportation for Alina and our heavier supplies. Mrs. Gutierrez watched me work with approval. "You're good at this," she observed. Taking care of people, organizing things, thinking ahead. Maybe you missed your calling. I don't know, I said honestly. I never thought about leadership before all this happened. I just wanted to make art and run a successful tattoo shop. Sometimes life decides what we're supposed to do, she replied. Sometimes we don't get to choose our purpose. It chooses us. The morning of January 10th brought the news that changed everything. Alina collapsed while helping to organize supplies, her breathing shallow and labored. When I checked on her, her lips had a blue tinge that even my untrained eye recognized as dangerous. She was dying, and there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. But Alina wasn't ready to give up yet. "Help me sit up," she whispered. "I want to see your drawings, all of them. I want to remember what we've been through together." I brought out my sketchbooks, all the portraits and scenes and documentation I'd created over the past 3 months. Alina studied each page carefully, her breathing getting more labored but her eyes still sharp and focused. She pointed to specific drawings, telling me stories about the people and places I'd captured, adding context and meaning to images that had been just observations to me. "This one," she said, pointing to a sketch of Mrs. Gutierrez kneading dough in the early days after the eruption. She was worried about her grandchildren in Phoenix, but she never said anything because she didn't want us to worry too. "She's been giving us the biggest portions of food because she thinks we're too skinny." "And this one," she continued, indicating a drawing of Roberto working on our makeshift heating system. "He tells everyone the Virgin Mary tattoo you gave him is what's keeping him alive. Says she watches over all of us now." Alina went through every sketch, every portrait, every scene I'd documented over the past 90 days. She turned my art into history, my observations into stories worth preserving. By the time we reached the last page, I understood that what I'd been creating wasn't just personal expression or even historical documentation. It was a testament to the love and courage and determination that had kept us alive when everything else fell apart. "Promise me something," Alina said as she handed back the sketchbooks. "Promise me you'll keep drawing, keep telling our story. Make sure people understand that we didn't just survive. We took care of each other. We stayed human." I promised, and I meant it. Alina died 3 hours later, peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the people who'd become her family in the last months of her life. We buried her in the small garden behind Mrs. Gutierrez's store, marking her grave with a wooden cross Roberto carved from one of my broken easels. I drew her portrait one final time, capturing the peaceful expression she wore in death, the face of someone who'd given everything she had to help others survive. That night, as we sat around our small fire sharing memories of Alina, the radio brought news that would determine our immediate future. A convoy was forming in Long Beach, scheduled to depart for the Mexican border on January 20th. It was our chance to head south, to find warmth and safety, and possibly Maria. But it meant leaving behind everything familiar, everything that connected us to the life we'd known before the world changed. "We go," Mrs. Gutierrez said firmly. "Alina would want us to go. She'd want us to find your sister and get somewhere safe." Roberto nodded agreement. "We've proven we can survive together. Now we prove we can build something better somewhere else." As I packed my art supplies and sketchbooks, preparing for a journey into an uncertain future, I thought about Alina's final words. "Keep drawing. Keep telling our story. Make sure people understand." The weight of that responsibility felt enormous, but also somehow comforting. Whatever happened next, I had a purpose beyond just staying alive. I had a mission to document not just our survival, but our humanity. To prove that even when the world ends, love and loyalty and community can endure. The convoy departure was still 10 days away, but already I was planning how to continue my documentation during the journey south. How to capture the landscape of our changed world, the faces of other survivors we'd meet, the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. My steady hands and trained eye would preserve this chapter of human history, this story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when everything they'd known disappeared under ash and snow. We were leaving Los Angeles, leaving the neighborhood that had shaped us and the community that had saved us. But we were taking with us everything that really mattered: each other, our shared memories, and the determination to build something worth preserving wherever we ended up. Elena was gone, but her wisdom would travel with us. Her belief in our capacity for love and sacrifice would guide us through whatever challenges lay ahead on the road to San Diego, to Maria, to whatever future we could create together. The convoy to Long Beach never happened. On January 15th, 5 days before we were supposed to leave, the radio broadcasts stopped coming. The last transmission we heard was fragmentary and desperate, something about hostile groups blocking the highways and supplies running dangerously low. Roberto and I took turns trying different frequencies for hours, but found only static and silence. We were on our own again, and winter was getting worse. The decision to head south on foot came naturally after 3 days of radio silence. We couldn't stay in the neighborhood much longer without more supplies, and Alina's death had shown us how quickly our situation could become desperate. Mrs. Gutierrez had been rationing our food so carefully that we were all losing weight, and the cold was becoming unbearable even with our makeshift heating systems. "We go slow, we go careful, and we stick together," I told the group as we planned our route. My community organizing skills were being tested in ways I'd never imagined, but the principles were the same: keep everyone informed, make decisions collectively, and never leave anyone behind. I spread out my hand-drawn maps on the floor of my shop, pointing out the route I'd pieced together from radio broadcasts and Roberto's knowledge of the construction sites between LA and San Diego. Roberto studied the maps with the careful attention he'd once given to blueprints. "This stretch here," he said, pointing to a section near Anaheim, "used to be all strip malls and housing developments. Lots of places to take shelter, but also lots of places for other people to hide. Could be dangerous." Dangerous. We'd been hearing stories on the radio about survivor groups that had turned hostile, people who decided that taking what they needed was more important than helping each other. The thought of encountering armed scavengers terrified me, but staying in LA meant certain death from cold and starvation. At least on the road we had a chance. Mrs. Gutierrez had been teaching me some of her late husband's mechanical knowledge over the past few weeks, showing me how to use the tools she'd inherited from him. "Engines are like hearts," she explained as we worked on a shopping cart that would carry our supplies. "They need fuel, they need air, and they need someone who understands how they work." Her hands guided mine as I learned to tighten bolts and adjust wheels, my artistic precision translating surprisingly well to mechanical tasks. My steady hands proved essential for preparing our equipment. I reinforced the shopping cart with metal strips scavenged from abandoned buildings, creating secure compartments for our most valuable supplies. My art materials went into a waterproof container that I could carry on my back, along with Alina's rosary and the portrait I'd drawn of her. Everything else was organized by weight and necessity, with the heaviest items going into the cart. The morning we left was gray and bitter cold, with ash still falling steadily from the overcast sky. January 20th, exactly 3 months since Yellowstone erupted. I took one last look at my tattoo shop, at the flash sheets on the walls and the equipment I'd spent years collecting. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the small group of people who'd become my family, and the supplies that would keep us alive on the journey south. Mrs. Gutierrez locked her store with ceremony, kissing her fingers and touching the door frame like she was blessing it. 40 years, she said quietly. 40 years I worked in this neighborhood. Now we leave it to the ash. But there was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance and determination to survive whatever came next. The first day of travel taught us hard lessons about what we could and couldn't do. The shopping cart was heavier than expected, requiring 2 people to push it through the ash-covered streets. Our pace was impossibly slow, maybe a mile an hour over clear ground, much less when we had to navigate around abandoned cars or debris. Most challenging was finding drinkable water and safe places to rest. Roberto had developed a system for scouting ahead, while the rest of us managed the cart and supplies. His construction worker knowledge of Los Angeles geography was invaluable, helping us avoid the worst bottlenecks and find buildings that were structurally sound enough for overnight shelter. But I could see the strain on his face as he took on the responsibility of keeping us safe. The Virgin Mary tattoo on his shoulder had become a symbol of protection for all of us, and he took that role seriously. By the third day, we'd encountered our first other survivors. A family of 5, including 2 small children, camped in what used to be a McDonald's parking lot. They looked even worse than we felt, thin and desperate and suspicious of strangers. The father kept his hand on a baseball bat while we talked, but the mother looked at our supplies with hungry eyes. "You heading south too?" the father asked. His voice was hoarse from breathing ash, and I could see infected cuts on his hands that needed medical attention. "San Diego," I replied carefully. "Looking for family there, you?" "Anywhere warmer than this," he said. "Kids can't take much more cold." Mrs. Gutierrez had been quietly studying the family while we talked. She caught my eye and nodded slightly, a signal we developed for situations like this. We had enough supplies to share, and the children needed help. My perfectionist nature wanted to calculate exactly how much we could spare without endangering ourselves, but sometimes survival requires taking risks for the right reasons. "We can share some food," I offered, "and I've got some medical supplies that might help with those cuts." The relief on the parents' faces was immediate and profound. As I cleaned the father's infected wounds with supplies from Alina's first aid kit, using my steady hands to be as gentle as possible, I thought about what Alina had said about staying human, taking care of strangers when you barely have enough for yourself. That's what separates civilization from barbarism. The family traveled with us for 2 days before their youngest child became too sick to continue. The parents made the difficult decision to stay in Orange County and look for medical help, while we continued south towards San Diego. It was our first real separation from people we'd started to care about, and it taught me something important about the psychology of survival. You can't save everyone, but you can make sure that everyone you meet is better off for having encountered you. My documentation of the journey became more detailed and urgent as we got further from Los Angeles. I sketched the abandoned shopping centers and empty schools, the cars buried under ash, and the occasional signs of other survivor groups. But I also drew the moments of beauty that still existed. Mrs. Gutierrez sharing her last piece of candy with a child, Roberto helping an elderly man repair his shelter. The way snow looked when it caught the filtered sunlight just right. "Why do you keep drawing?" one of Roberto's construction friends asked me as we sheltered in an abandoned gas station. "Seems like a waste of energy when we need to focus on staying alive." It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. But Alina's words kept coming back to me. Someone needs to remember this. Someone needs to make sure people understand what we went through and how we took care of each other. My art wasn't separate from survival, it was part of it. It was how I preserved the meaning behind our struggle. "Because someday this will be over," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. "And when it is, people need to know what happened here. They need to know that ordinary people did extraordinary things, that we didn't just survive, we stayed human." The radio had been silent for over a week when we finally picked up a weak signal from somewhere near San Diego. The voice was different from the Orange County broadcasts we'd been hearing, younger and more optimistic. "This is UCSD Emergency Radio, broadcasting from the university campus. If anyone is listening, we want you to know that San Diego County has resources and shelter available for refugees from the north. We have medical facilities, food distribution, and temporary housing. The worst of the ash fall has passed, and temperatures here are stabilizing above freezing." San Diego, the university campus. Maria was studying nursing at UC San Diego. For the first time since we'd left Los Angeles, I allowed myself to hope that we might actually find her alive and safe. My perfectionist nature kicked in as I started planning our approach to the city, thinking about how to locate the campus and what we'd need to do to find one nursing student among thousands of refugees. But the closer we got to San Diego, the more dangerous our journey became. We started encountering other groups more frequently, and not all of them were friendly. Some were just desperate families like ours, trying to reach safety. Others were clearly predatory, looking for easier targets than the well-defended communities they'd been excluded from. Roberto's scouting became more cautious, and we started traveling primarily at night to avoid unwanted encounters. The worst incident happened near Oceanside, just 30 miles north of San Diego. We'd taken shelter in an abandoned grocery store for the night when 3 men approached our camp. They claimed to be traders, offering to exchange information about safe routes for some of our supplies. But their body language was wrong, too aggressive and entitled, and I could see weapons poorly concealed under their jackets. "We don't need anything you're selling," Roberto told them firmly, positioning himself between the strangers and our group. "That's not very neighborly," one of them replied, his hand moving toward his jacket. "This is dangerous country for travelers. Accidents happen to people who don't make friends." Mrs. Gutierrez had been quietly moving during this conversation, positioning herself where she could protect our supplies. I admired her courage, but I could see that she was terrified. We all were. None of us were fighters, and these men clearly had experience with violence that we lacked. That's when my artistic training saved us. I'd been sketching obsessively throughout our journey, documenting everything we encountered. Without thinking, I pulled out my sketchbook and showed them detailed drawings of the route we'd traveled, including several images of well-armed survivor groups we'd encountered along the way. "These are the people we've been traveling with," I lied smoothly. "They're about half a day behind us, probably wondering where we are by now." The 3 men studied my drawings with uncomfortable attention. The sketches were detailed enough to be convincing, and the implied threat of a larger, armed group was enough to change their calculation about whether we were worth the risk. They left without violence, but not before making it clear that we shouldn't count on being lucky next time. "Quick thinking," Roberto said after they were gone, "but we need to be more careful. Next group might not be so easily discouraged." The incident shook all of us, but it also taught me something important about the power of documentation. My art wasn't just recording our journey, it was actively helping us survive it. The detailed sketches that had started as historical documentation were becoming tools for navigation, negotiation, and protection. As we approached San Diego County, the landscape began to change in subtle but important ways. The ash was less thick, the temperature slightly warmer, and we started seeing signs of organized human activity. Smoke from cooking fires, maintained roadblocks, even some cultivated gardens protected by makeshift greenhouses. Civilization was holding on here in ways it hadn't further north. The university radio broadcasts became clearer and more detailed as we got closer to the city. They provided specific information about refugee processing centers, medical facilities, and housing assignments. Most importantly, they broadcast daily lists of people who'd registered with the campus authorities. I listened obsessively, hoping to hear Maria's name, but the lists were long and the reception was often poor. Mrs. Gutierrez had been getting stronger as we traveled south, benefiting from the warmer weather and better food opportunities. Her knowledge of folk remedies had kept all of us healthier than we had any right to be, and her mechanical wisdom had kept our equipment functioning despite constant use. But I could see that she was worried about what would happen when we reached San Diego. "What if your sister isn't there?" she asked me one evening as we camped in the ruins of a seaside hotel. "What if we get there and she's moved on, or worse?" It was the question I'd been avoiding for weeks. Everything we'd done, every risk we'd taken, had been based on the assumption that Maria was alive and safe in San Diego. If that assumption was wrong, if we'd traveled hundreds of miles through hostile territory for nothing, I wasn't sure how I'd handle the disappointment. "Then we make a new plan," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We've proven we can survive together. We've proven we can take care of each other. Whatever we find in San Diego, we'll figure out how to deal with it. Roberto nodded agreement. That's right, we're family now. Doesn't matter what happens next, we face it together. The last night before reaching San Diego, I stayed up late working on a comprehensive sketch of our group as we'd become over the months of travel and survival. Mrs. Gutierrez sleeping peacefully under blankets she'd sewn from scavenged fabric. Roberto maintaining his vigilant watch, the Virgin Mary tattoo visible on his shoulder as he tended our small fire. The faces of people who'd started as neighbors and customers and become the most important relationships in my life. Tomorrow, we'd reach the university campus and begin looking for Maria. Tomorrow, we'd learn whether the hope that had sustained us through 3 months of hell was justified or misplaced. Tomorrow, we'd discover what kind of future was possible for survivors of the Ice Age apocalypse. But tonight, sitting in the ruins of the old world with my chosen family sleeping safely around me, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Yellowstone erupted. I felt proud. Proud of what we'd accomplished. Proud of how we'd taken care of each other. Proud of the record I'd created of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when everything familiar disappeared. My steady hands moved across the paper, capturing details that would help me remember this moment for the rest of my life. Whatever happened next, whatever we found or didn't find in San Diego, this journey had proven something important about human nature. When the world ends, love doesn't disappear, community doesn't vanish. The things that make us human become more important, not less. Elena had been right. We hadn't just survived. We'd stayed human. And tomorrow, in San Diego, we'd find out what came next for humans like us in a world that would never be the same. San Diego looked like salvation until we got close enough to see the razor wire. The university campus that had sounded so welcoming on the radio broadcasts was surrounded by high fences and armed guards, with refugee camps sprawling for miles in every direction. Thousands of people living in tents and makeshift shelters, all hoping for admission to what had become the last functioning city in Southern California. We joined the registration line on February 8th, 60 days after leaving Los Angeles, tired and filthy but alive. The process was overwhelming. Forms to fill out, medical examinations, interviews about our skills and backgrounds. I watched Mrs. Gutierrez navigate the bureaucracy with the same determination she'd shown throughout our journey, answering questions about her baking experience and mechanical knowledge, while Roberto explained his construction background to a harried intake officer. Joaquin Morales, I told the registration clerk when my turn came. Tattoo artist from East LA. I'm looking for my sister, Maria Morales. She was a nursing student here before the eruption. The clerk, a young woman who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, consulted a massive paper ledger. Maria Morales' nursing program. Yes, she's registered. But I have to warn you, the campus is at capacity. Your group will be assigned to external housing until space becomes available inside the perimeter. Maria was alive. After months of uncertainty and hope and fear, those 4 words changed everything. She was alive, she was here, and somehow we'd managed to find her in a world that had fallen apart. I felt tears on my face for the first time since Elena's death, relief so profound it was almost painful. The external housing turned out to be a tent city that stretched along the coast, organized into districts based on arrival date and family size. Our group was assigned space in Sector 7, a collection of military surplus tents surrounded by a community garden and makeshift workshops. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warmer than anything we'd experienced in months, and there were regular food distributions and medical care available. Finding Maria took 3 more days of navigating the camp's complex social structure. She was working in the medical district, helping staff the clinic that served the refugee population. When I finally saw her, she was treating a child with pneumonia, her hands steady and professional as she administered medication and checked vital signs. She'd grown thinner and more serious during our months apart, but she was unmistakably the sister I'd traveled hundreds of miles to find. "Joe Quinn," she said when she saw me, dropping everything to wrap me in a hug that lasted several minutes. "I can't believe you made it. I kept listening to the radio broadcasts, hoping I'd hear something about survivors from LA, but there was nothing. I thought you were dead." I introduced her to Mrs. Gutierrez and Roberto and the others who'd become our family during the journey south. Maria listened to our stories with professional attention, occasionally asking medical questions about symptoms or treatments we'd encountered. But I could see something guarded in her expression, a carefulness that hadn't been there before the world changed. "It's not as good here as the radio makes it sound," she told me privately after we'd settled into our assigned tent. "There are resources, yes, but there are also politics, factions, people who have decided that some survivors deserve help more than others. The university administration controls everything, and they're not always fair about how they make decisions." Politics. Even at the end of the world, human nature created hierarchies and power struggles. I'd been naive to think that reaching San Diego would solve all our problems. It was better than freezing to death in Los Angeles, but it came with complications I hadn't anticipated. Maria had been keeping secrets during our separation, and over the next few days she began sharing them with me. The nursing program had been suspended indefinitely, with students reassigned to support medical operations throughout the camp. Food was more plentiful than what we'd experienced on the road, but it was still rationed and sometimes inconsistent. Most concerning, there were rumors about forced relocations and deportations for refugees who were deemed non-essential to the community's survival. "They call it optimization," Maria explained as we walked through the medical district where she worked, "making sure resources go to people who can contribute most effectively to long-term sustainability. It sounds reasonable until you realize they're talking about abandoning sick people and elderly people and anyone who can't work." The optimization policy became personal when Mrs. Gutierrez received a medical evaluation that classified her as a low-priority refugee. At 72 years old with arthritis and high blood pressure, she was considered a drain on resources rather than a contributor to community survival. The recommendation was relocation to a camp further inland, away from the better medical facilities and food distribution systems. "This is what we survived for," Mrs. Gutierrez asked bitterly after receiving her evaluation notice. "To be thrown away by people who think they're smarter than us." I studied the relocation order with growing anger, my artistic attention to detail revealing the bureaucratic language that made disposal of inconvenient people sound like rational policy. Mrs. Gutierrez had kept us alive with her knowledge and wisdom and generosity. She'd taught me mechanical skills that had been essential to our survival. She'd been the emotional center of our group through months of hardship and loss. Now strangers were deciding she wasn't worth the food she ate. "We don't accept this," I told her firmly. "We've come too far together to be separated by bureaucrats who don't understand what we've been through." Roberto agreed immediately. "That's right. We stick together, just like we promised Alina. Family doesn't get abandoned." But fighting the relocation order required navigating a system I didn't understand, dealing with administrators who saw refugees as problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. My community organizing skills were tested in new ways as I tried to build support for Mrs. Gutierrez's case, talking to other refugees who faced similar situations and looking for allies among the camp staff. Maria's position in the medical district gave her some influence, but using it to help Mrs. Gutierrez would put her own status at risk. "If I push too hard on this, they might decide I'm not cooperative enough to keep around," she warned me. "Then I can't help anyone." It was the same impossible choice we'd faced throughout our journey: risk everything to help one person, or accept a smaller loss to preserve the group's overall survival. But something had changed in me during the months since Alina's death. I'd learned that the moral compromises you make to survive sometimes cost more than the physical hardships you endure. Then we leave, I said after a week of unsuccessful appeals and negotiations. All of us, together, we find somewhere else to build the life we want. The decision to leave San Diego wasn't made lightly. We traveled hundreds of miles to reach safety, only to discover that safety came with conditions we couldn't accept. But the refugee camp had taught us valuable lessons about what worked and what didn't in post-apocalypse community building. We'd seen successful cooperative projects and devastating power struggles. We'd observed sustainable resource management and wasteful bureaucratic inefficiency. Most importantly, we'd confirmed that there were other survivor communities throughout the region, some of which might be more compatible with our values. My documentation of the San Diego camp became more systematic and analytical during our final weeks there. I sketched the layout of successful community gardens, the design of efficient cooking and sanitation facilities, the organizational structure of workshops that trained refugees in essential skills. But I also drew the faces of people who'd been broken by the classification system, families separated by medical evaluations, children who'd learned to hide their feelings because emotional displays were considered disruptive. "You're building a manual," Maria observed as she watched me work on detailed drawings of camp infrastructure. "Instructions for how to survive when society collapses." She was right, though I hadn't thought of it that way. My artistic documentation had evolved into something more practical and forward-looking. These weren't just memories of what we'd experienced. They were blueprints for what we might build next. The steady hands that had once created tattoos were now designing communities. The opportunity to leave came from an unexpected source. A trader who visited the camp regularly had been watching our group with interest, particularly impressed by Mrs. Gutierrez's mechanical knowledge and Roberto's construction skills. He represented a coalition of small communities along the Mexican border, settlements that were actively recruiting skilled refugees who were willing to work hard and contribute to collective survival. "It's not easy," he warned us during a private meeting in his battered truck. "These communities are small, maybe 50 to 100 people each. Everyone works, everyone contributes, and there's no room for people who can't pull their weight. But there's also no bureaucracy deciding who deserves to live and who doesn't. You succeed or fail together." The border communities sounded like what we'd been trying to create all along. Small groups of people who'd chosen to take care of each other, who'd built their societies around mutual aid rather than hierarchical control. It was risky to leave the relative security of San Diego for something unknown, but it was also an opportunity to live according to our values instead of compromising them for safety. Mrs. Gutierrez was enthusiastic about the possibility. "I'd rather die trying to build something good than live accepting something wrong," she said firmly. "These people in San Diego, they've learned the wrong lessons from what happened. They think survival means becoming hard and selfish. But we know better." Maria's decision was more complicated. Leaving San Diego meant abandoning her medical training and the possibility of completing her nursing degree. The border communities needed medical knowledge, but they couldn't offer the formal education and certification that had been her goal before the world changed. "Skills matter more than credentials now," I reminded her. "What you know about medicine and healing, that's valuable anywhere there are people who need help. You don't need a diploma to save lives." "I know," she said quietly. "It's just hard to let go of the future I'd planned, even when that future doesn't exist anymore." The trader, whose name was Carlos, had been visiting refugee camps throughout Southern California for months, recruiting people for the border communities. He'd seen the rise and fall of dozens of survival experiments, the successes and failures that marked humanity's adaptation to the post-eruption world. His perspective on what worked was invaluable. "The communities that survive long-term have three things in common," he explained as we prepared for departure. "They're small enough that everyone knows everyone else. They're isolated enough to control who joins and who doesn't. And they're led by people who understand that individual survival depends on group survival. Sounds like that describes your group pretty well. Our departure from San Diego was quieter than our arrival. We left at dawn on March 15th, exactly 4 months after reaching the refugee camp, with supplies provided by carloads and letters of introduction to 3 different border communities. The camp administrators seemed relieved to see us go, one less problem to manage in their overcrowded system. But we weren't leaving empty-handed. Besides the physical supplies and knowledge we'd gained, we were carrying something more valuable. We'd proven to ourselves that it was possible to maintain our values even when survival was uncertain. We'd chosen community over security, cooperation over competition, and hope over fear. Those choices had costs, but they'd also preserved something essential about who we were as human beings. The journey south toward the Mexican border took us through landscape that was slowly recovering from the initial devastation of the ash fall. Plants were growing again, rivers were running clearer, and the sun was strong enough to provide real warmth during the day. The ice age wasn't over, but life was adapting, finding ways to survive and even thrive in the changed world. My sketching during this part of our journey focused on signs of recovery and renewal. New growth emerging from ash-covered soil. Wildlife returning to areas that had been devastated months earlier. Human communities that had found sustainable ways to live in the transformed environment. The documentation was becoming more hopeful, more focused on possibilities than just survival. "You're different now," Maria observed as we walked together on our second day of travel. "More confident, more purposeful, like you know exactly what you're supposed to be doing." She was right. The months of struggle and loss and small victories had changed me in ways I was still discovering. The tattoo artist who'd been inking a Virgin Mary when the world ended had become something else. A community organizer, a documentarian, a person who understood that survival was about more than just staying alive. It was about preserving what made survival worthwhile. Roberto had changed too, growing into a leadership role that complemented my own. Where I planned and organized and documented, he scouted and protected and made the tactical decisions that kept us safe on the road. The Virgin Mary tattoo on his shoulder had become a symbol not just of protection, but of the family we'd created together through shared hardship. Mrs. Gutierrez remained the emotional center of our group, the person whose wisdom and humor and stubborn optimism kept us focused on building rather than just surviving. Her mechanical knowledge had expanded during our time in San Diego, learning from other refugees who'd brought different skills and experiences to the camp. She was eager to put that knowledge to work in a community that would value her contributions rather than seeing her as a burden. The first border community we visited wasn't right for us. Too militaristic, with strict hierarchies and rules that reminded us uncomfortably of the San Diego refugee camp. The second was more promising but already full, unable to accommodate our group without straining their resources. But the third community, a settlement called Esperanza built around a natural spring near the coast, felt like home from the moment we arrived. Esperanza had been founded by a group of teachers and farmers who'd left Los Angeles together in the early days after the eruption. They'd built their community around education and sustainable agriculture, creating systems that could support themselves indefinitely without depending on external resources. Most importantly, they'd structured their society around collective decision-making and mutual aid rather than hierarchical control. "We've been hoping to find someone with medical training," the community's coordinator, a former high school principal named David, told us during our introduction meeting. "And a tattoo artist who can also do technical drawing would be incredibly valuable for our planning and documentation projects." Maria's medical knowledge was immediately useful, helping to establish better sanitation systems and treat minor injuries that had been limiting people's ability to work effectively. My artistic skills translated into map making, architectural planning, and the kind of detailed documentation that helped the community learn from its successes and failures. But the most important contribution our group made to Esperanza was simply the example of what we'd accomplished together. Our story of survival and mutual aid, documented in hundreds of sketches and remembered in countless shared experiences, provided a model for how people could take care of each other when everything familiar disappeared. "You've proven something important," David told me as we worked together on plans for expanding the community's housing. "You've shown that family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about choosing to be responsible for each other's welfare, even when that choice is difficult or dangerous." The integration into Esperanza wasn't without challenges. Every community has its own culture and ways of doing things, and we had to learn new social dynamics while contributing our skills and knowledge. But the fundamental values were compatible with what we developed during our journey. Take care of each other, share resources fairly, make decisions collectively, and never abandon someone who needs help. My documentation of life in Esperanza became more focused on solutions and possibilities than on survival and struggle. I drew detailed plans for sustainable housing, efficient food production systems, and community workshops that could maintain and repair the tools and equipment essential to their way of life. The sketches were still historical records, but they were also blueprints for building the future. Mrs. Gutierrez found her place teaching mechanical skills to young people who'd grown up in a world where such knowledge was essential for survival. Roberto became part of the construction crew that was expanding the community's infrastructure. Maria established a medical clinic that served not just Esperanza but several neighboring communities. And I became the person who documented everything, who preserved the memory of what they'd built and how they'd built it. 6 months after leaving San Diego, I was working on a comprehensive illustrated manual of post-apocalypse community building when Maria found me in the workshop I'd established for my documentation projects. She'd been visiting other communities along the border, sharing medical knowledge and learning about different approaches to sustainable living. "I've been thinking about what Alina said," she told me as she studied my latest drawings, "about staying human when the world ends. I think we've done that. I think we've actually built something better than what existed before." Looking around at Esperanza, at the gardens and workshops and community spaces that represented humanity's determination to not just survive but thrive, I had to agree with her. We'd lost the old world, but we'd gained something that might be more valuable. We'd learned that community wasn't just convenient, it was essential. We'd discovered that cooperation was stronger than competition. We'd proven that love and loyalty and mutual aid could sustain people through anything. The Ice Age was far from over. The world was still cold and difficult and full of challenges that would test every community's ability to survive. But we'd established something that could last, something that could grow, something that proved human beings were capable of choosing hope over fear when everything familiar disappeared. My steady hands would keep documenting that choice, preserving the story of how ordinary people built extraordinary communities when the world needed them most. The attack on Esperanza came without warning on a Tuesday morning in late March, exactly 90 days after we'd found our new home. I was in my workshop, adding details to a technical drawing of the community's water filtration system, when Roberto burst through the door with blood on his shirt and panic in his eyes. "They took Maria," he said, breathing hard from running. "Armed group, maybe 15 people. They hit the medical clinic first, then grabbed supplies from the storehouse. David's organizing a response, but they had vehicles. They're already gone." The world tilted sideways for a moment. Maria, who'd survived the Ice Age apocalypse and the refugee camps and months of dangerous travel, had been taken by raiders who saw medical knowledge as a commodity to be stolen. The sister I'd crossed half of California to find was gone again, and this time I had no idea where to look for her. Mrs. Gutierrez appeared beside Roberto, her face grim but determined. "The traitor Carlos is here," she said. "He knows these raiders. says they've been hitting communities all along the border, taking doctors and nurses and anyone with medical training, selling them to settlements that can pay. Slavery. The word hung in the air like poison. We'd rebuilt civilization only to discover that some people were willing to destroy it for profit. The cooperative communities we'd worked so hard to create were being targeted by predators who understood that medical knowledge was the most valuable resource in a world where hospitals no longer existed. Carlos was waiting in the community meeting hall, his weathered face showing the strain of delivering terrible news to people he'd come to consider friends. "The group that took your sister calls themselves the Scavengers," he explained to the assembled community. "They're based somewhere in the desert east of here, probably moving between different camps to avoid retaliation. They've been active for months, targeting small communities that can't defend themselves effectively." David, the former principal who coordinated Esperanza's collective decision-making, was struggling to maintain his usual calm demeanor. "What do they want? Can we negotiate?" "They want trade goods, fuel, weapons, food, things they can use or sell to other communities, but mostly they want specialists, people with skills that are hard to replace. Doctors, engineers, anyone who knows how to make the technology work that keeps us alive." The conversation that followed was the most difficult Esperanza had faced since its founding. Some community members wanted to organize an immediate rescue mission, despite not knowing where Maria had been taken or how many raiders they'd be facing. Others argued for increased security measures and defensive preparations, accepting Maria's loss as the price of protecting everyone else from future attacks. "We don't abandon family," I said when my turn came to speak. My voice was steadier than I felt, drawing on the same determination that had carried us from Los Angeles to San Diego to this desert oasis. "Maria risked everything to get here with us. Now we risk everything to get her back." Mrs. Gutierrez nodded agreement. "That girl has saved more lives than we can count. She's taught half our children how to treat injuries and illness. If we don't fight for her, what kind of people are we?" Roberto was already thinking tactically, his construction worker's understanding of logistics applying to rescue planning. "Carlos, you know the territory better than anyone. What would it take to track these scavengers down?" The plan that emerged over the next 3 days was ambitious and dangerous. Carlos would use his trading connection to gather intelligence about the scavengers' movements and possible locations. A small rescue team would follow their trail east into the desert, traveling light and fast to avoid detection. Meanwhile, Esperanza would prepare defensive measures in case the raiders returned while the rescue team was away. I insisted on being part of the rescue team, despite having no combat experience or survival skills beyond what I'd learned during our journey south. My artistic documentation had become essential to the community's planning and record keeping, but none of that mattered if Maria was being held captive somewhere in the wasteland. "You're not a fighter," David warned me during one of our planning sessions. "This isn't like the journey from LA. These people are armed and dangerous, and they've chosen violence as a way of life." "Neither was Roberto when we started this journey," I replied. "Neither was Mrs. Gutierrez. We became what we needed to become to take care of each other. That's what family does." The rescue team that finally departed Esperanza consisted of 6 people, Carlos as our guide and negotiator, Roberto and 2 other men from the construction crew who had some experience with weapons and tactics, a woman named Anna who'd been a paramedic before the eruption and could provide medical support, and me carrying my sketchbooks and drawing supplies along with the basic survival gear everyone else insisted I needed. Mrs. Gutierrez wanted to come with us, but her arthritis and high blood pressure made her a liability in what could become a combat situation. Instead, she took charge of organizing Esperanza's defenses, applying the mechanical knowledge she'd gained over months of survival to the problem of protecting a community from armed raiders. "Bring her back," she told me as we prepared to leave. "Bring my granddaughter back safe." Granddaughter. It was the first time Mrs. Gutierrez had used that word to describe Maria, but it captured something important about the relationships we'd built during our journey. The family we'd chosen was as real and binding as any biological connection, maybe more so because it was based on conscious decisions rather than accident of birth. The desert east of Esperanza was harsh and beautiful in ways that reminded me why I'd become an artist. Red rock formations carved by wind and water, vast expanses of sand and scrub brush punctuated by impossible green oases, skies so clear and blue they hurt to look at directly. Under other circumstances, I would have spent hours sketching the landscape. But every mile we traveled took us further from safety and deeper into territory controlled by people who saw violence as a reasonable business strategy. Carlos's intelligence network proved invaluable during our first days of searching. Traders and travelers throughout the region knew about the scavengers and their operations, though most were too frightened to provide detailed information. We learned that the raiders moved frequently between camps, never staying in one place long enough for organized retaliation. We learned that they maintained a main base somewhere near the old border crossing at Calexico, but that it was heavily defended and almost impossible to approach without being detected. Most importantly, we learned that Maria wasn't the only medical professional they'd captured. The scavengers had been systematically targeting doctors and nurses throughout Southern California, building a collection of medical slaves who could be rented out to communities willing to pay for their services. It was a horrifying perversion of the cooperation and mutual aid that had allowed places like Esperanza to thrive. "They're not just raiders," Anna observed as we made camp on our fourth night of searching. "They're parasites. They're feeding off the communities that are trying to rebuild civilization, weakening them so they can never become strong enough to resist." The moral clarity of our mission helped sustain us through the physical hardships of desert travel. We were carrying limited water and food, traveling during the cooler parts of the day and hiding during the heat of midday sun. My artistic training helped me notice details that others missed, tracking signs of recent human activity and documenting our route in case we needed to find our way back quickly. On the sixth day, we found the first concrete evidence of Maria's location. A trading post near the ruins of El Centro reported that a group matching the scavenger's description had passed through 3 days earlier, heading northeast toward the Salton Sea. They'd had several captives with them, including a young woman who tried to treat injuries among the other prisoners. "That sounds like Maria," I said, studying the trader's description. "She wouldn't be able to watch people suffer without trying to help, even if they were her captors." The Salton Sea had been an ecological disaster even before the Ice Age apocalypse, a massive inland lake created by engineering mistakes and sustained by agricultural runoff. Now, with reduced water flow and increased evaporation, it was shrinking rapidly, leaving behind salt flats and abandoned resorts that provided perfect cover for groups that wanted to avoid detection. Carlos led us to a high ridge overlooking the southern shore, where we could observe the scavengers' temporary camp without being seen. The sight below was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because we could see Maria moving freely among the other captives, apparently uninjured and actively providing medical care. Terrifying because the camp was larger and better organized than we'd expected, with armed guards and defensive positions that would make any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. 15 fighters, minimum, Roberto assessed through the binoculars Carlos had provided. Automatic weapons, vehicles for quick escape, and they've positioned themselves so there's only one way in or out of the camp. Even if we had superior numbers, this would be a difficult target. The tactical situation seemed impossible, but my artistic eye was noticing details that suggested other possibilities. The camp's organization revealed patterns and routines that could be exploited. Guard rotations that created brief windows of reduced security. Supply deliveries that required opening the defensive perimeter. Most importantly, The fact that the medical captives were being allowed to move freely among the other prisoners suggested that the scavengers needed them healthy and cooperative. "We don't fight them," I said as the plan formed in my mind. "We give them something they want more than they want Maria." The negotiation took place the following evening, arranged through Carlos's trading contacts and conducted in the ruins of an old resort hotel on the shore of the dying lake. The scavenger leader, a man who called himself Captain Morrison, was exactly what I'd expected. Hard and cruel and utterly convinced that might made right in the post-apocalypse world. "Your sister's valuable," he told me without preamble. "Medical training, surgical skills, knowledge of pharmaceuticals. Communities pay well for that kind of expertise. Why should I give her up for whatever you're offering?" I'd been preparing for this moment since we'd first spotted the camp, organizing my thoughts and arguments with the same careful attention I brought to planning a complex tattoo design. Everything depended on convincing Morrison that he could get more value from Maria by trading her than by keeping her. "Because what I'm offering is worth more than one doctor," I replied, opening my largest sketchbook to reveal detailed technical drawings of Esperanza's infrastructure. "These are complete plans for sustainable community systems, water purification, food production, power generation, waste management, everything a settlement needs to become self-sufficient." Morrison studied the drawings with obvious interest, his businessman's instincts recognizing their potential value. Communities throughout the region were struggling with the same basic challenges of survival in the post-eruption world. Detailed technical knowledge about what worked and what didn't was incredibly valuable to anyone trying to build something lasting. "How do I know these plans actually work?" he asked suspiciously. "Because I documented them from a community that's been thriving for over a year," I said truthfully. "Every drawing shows something that's been tested and proven effective. Any settlement that implements these systems will be more successful than their neighbors." The negotiation continued for hours, with Morrison trying to determine exactly how much my documentation was worth compared to Maria's medical expertise. Other scavenger leaders joined the discussion, arguing about the relative value of immediate versus long-term assets. I let them talk, occasionally adding technical details that demonstrated the depth and accuracy of my work. Finally, Morrison made his decision. "The drawings, plus supplies for a week's travel, plus information about 3 other communities with valuable specialists. That's my final offer." It was extortion, but it was also Maria's freedom. I agreed to terms that would put other communities at risk, hoping I could find ways to warn them before the scavengers acted on the intelligence I was providing. Sometimes survival requires making choices that compromise your values, but the alternative was leaving family in the hands of people who saw human beings as commodities. The exchange took place at dawn, in the parking lot of an abandoned gas station halfway between our camps. Maria looked tired and angry but unharmed, her medical training having made her too valuable to mistreat. When she saw me approaching with the rescue team, her professional composure finally cracked. "Joaquin," she said, wrapping me in a hug that conveyed months of fear and uncertainty. "I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't abandon me." The journey back to Esperanza took 5 days, traveling carefully to avoid the scavenger patrols that were now actively hunting for us. Morrison had honored the exchange, but he'd also made it clear that our interference with his business operations wouldn't be forgotten or forgiven. We'd rescued Maria, but we'd also made enemies of people who specialized in violence and had no moral constraints on how they pursued their objectives. Maria's account of her captivity revealed the true scope of the scavenger operation. They weren't just random raiders taking advantage of post-apocalypse chaos. They were organized and systematic, building a business model based on capturing and selling skilled professionals to communities that couldn't train their own specialists. The medical slaves were just the beginning. They were also targeting engineers, teachers, mechanics, anyone whose knowledge was essential to rebuilding civilization. "They have maybe 30 medical professionals scattered across different camps," Maria explained during one of our rest stops. Doctors, nurses, paramedics, even veterinarians. They're being rented out to settlements that can afford to pay, creating a network of indentured servitude that spans hundreds of miles. The implications were staggering. The scavengers weren't just threatening individual communities like Esperanza. They were actively preventing the kind of cooperation and knowledge sharing that was essential to long-term recovery from the Ice Age apocalypse. By hoarding and controlling access to expertise, they were keeping survivor communities weak and dependent. When we finally reached Esperanza, the celebration of Maria's return was tempered by the recognition of what her rescue had cost. My technical drawings were now in the hands of people who would use them to make their predatory operations more effective. The intelligence I'd provided about other communities would put innocent people at risk. We'd saved one person by potentially dooming others. Mrs. Gutierrez understood the moral complexity of what we'd accomplished without needing detailed explanations. "You did what family does," she told me as we sat together in the garden she'd been expanding during our absence. "You chose the people you love over the people you don't know. That's human nature, and there's no shame in it." But I felt the weight of responsibility for the consequences of our actions. My artistic documentation, which had begun as a way to preserve memories and guide community building, had become a weapon in the hands of people who wanted to destroy everything we'd worked to create. The steady hands that had once tattooed symbols of hope and protection had traded away other people's safety for my sister's freedom. David and the other community coordinators were struggling with the same moral dilemmas on a larger scale. Esperanza's success made it a target for groups like the scavengers, but isolating themselves from other communities would contradict the values of cooperation and mutual aid that defined their identity. How do you build something worth preserving without attracting the attention of people who want to destroy it? The answer, when it came, emerged from an unexpected source. Carlos, who'd been traveling throughout the region gathering intelligence about scavenger operations, returned with news of a growing resistance movement. Communities that had been targeted by raiders were beginning to coordinate their defensive efforts, sharing information and resources to make themselves harder targets. "They're calling it the Border Alliance," Carlos explained during a community meeting. "Maybe 20 settlements from the coast to Arizona. They're not trying to build an army or start a war. They're just trying to make it too expensive for groups like the scavengers to operate in their territory." The alliance wasn't offering military solutions to the raider problem. Instead, they were implementing economic and social strategies that made predatory operations less profitable. Rapid communication networks that warned communities about approaching threats. Collective defense agreements that ensured raiders would face coordinated resistance. Most importantly, knowledge-sharing programs that reduced communities' dependence on individual specialists who could be captured and enslaved. Maria's medical expertise became crucial to developing these knowledge-sharing programs. Instead of being the only person in Esperanza who understood advanced medical procedures, she began training others in her skills, creating redundancy that would make the community less vulnerable to future raids. My artistic documentation supported this effort, creating detailed illustrated manuals that could teach complex procedures to people without formal medical education. "We make ourselves less valuable as targets," Maria explained as she worked with a group of community members on basic surgical techniques. "If every settlement has multiple people who can handle medical emergencies, then capturing one doctor doesn't give raiders the leverage they're looking for." The distributed knowledge approach appealed to my artist's understanding of how skills and techniques spread through communities. Instead of hoarding expertise like the scavengers, we were sharing it freely, making everyone stronger and more capable of independent survival. It was the opposite of the slave trade model, and it offered hope for breaking the cycle of predation that threatened all the border communities. Over the following months, my role in Esperanza evolved from community documentarian to regional coordinator for the knowledge-sharing project. My artistic skills were essential for creating the illustrated manuals and technical drawings that allowed complex information to be transmitted between communities with different educational backgrounds and literacy levels. The work was demanding and sometimes dangerous, requiring travel to settlements throughout Alliance territory to gather information and distribute training materials. But it was also profoundly satisfying, representing everything I'd learned about the power of art to preserve and share essential knowledge. Elena's words about staying human had evolved into a mission to help humanity not just survive, but grow stronger through cooperation. The scavengers adapted to the Alliance's strategies, becoming more violent and desperate as their business model became less profitable. Raids increased in frequency but decreased in success, as better prepared communities proved capable of defending themselves effectively. The medical slave trade continued, but on a smaller scale, as settlements developed their own training programs and reduced their dependence on outside specialists. Roberto had become one of the Alliance's military coordinators, using his construction background to design defensive fortifications and early warning systems. Mrs. Gutierrez led workshops on mechanical skills and resource management, her knowledge proving valuable to communities throughout the region. Even in her 70s, she was actively contributing to the rebuilding of civilization, proving wrong everyone who tried to classify her as a burden rather than an asset. By the end of our first year in Esperanza, the community had grown from 50 people to over 100, with new arrivals bringing skills and knowledge that strengthened everyone's prospects for long-term survival. The gardens produced enough food to trade surpluses with neighboring settlements. The workshops manufactured tools and equipment that were in demand throughout the region. Most importantly, the social systems based on collective decision-making and mutual aid had proven capable of incorporating new members without losing their essential character. My documentation project had expanded beyond Esperanza to encompass the entire border alliance, creating a comprehensive record of successful post-apocalypse community-building strategies. The illustrated manuals and technical drawings were being copied and distributed throughout survivor settlements from California to Texas, spreading knowledge that increased everyone's chances of not just surviving but thriving in the changed world. Standing in my workshop on a warm evening in late spring, surrounded by hundreds of drawings and documents that represented humanity's determination to rebuild better than before, I thought about how far we'd all traveled since that Tuesday afternoon when the phone started screaming in my tattoo shop. The Ice Age apocalypse had taken away the old world, but it had also given us the opportunity to create something new, something based on the values that mattered most when everything else disappeared. Maria had become the Alliance's chief medical coordinator, traveling between communities to train local healers and coordinate response to medical emergencies. Roberto was designing defensive systems that protected families and communities throughout the region. Mrs. Gutierrez was passing on the mechanical knowledge that kept essential systems functioning when replacement parts were impossible to find. And I was doing what Elena had asked me to do, documenting our story, preserving the memory of how ordinary people had chosen love over fear when the world fell apart. The steady hands that had once created tattoos were now creating blueprints for humanity's future, proving that art and survival weren't opposite priorities, but complementary aspects of what it meant to be human. The Ice Age wasn't over. The world was still cold and dangerous and full of challenges that tested every community's ability to survive and thrive. But we'd learned something important during those first 90 days after Yellowstone erupted. We'd learned that the end of the world wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning, an opportunity to build the kind of society we'd always wanted but never thought possible. All it took was choosing to take care of each other, no matter what the cost, and never giving up on the possibility that tomorrow could be better than today.